All right. So that appeared, you said in 1988, correct? Or was it
Yeah,
80,
yeah,
80?
it was 88.
Was it a landmark two-parter for you? Did you
So
really?
I was talking about how long the article was. So it eventually got split up over two issues, issue 143 and 144, in the summer of 1988.
So what kind of feedback did you get at the time?
It's an interesting question. No one's ever asked that before. The reason why I think it worked better in Amazing Heroes was because Amazing Heroes had a bigger audience. And I think that possibly that's what the Fantagraphics people thought too, was like, this really belongs in Comics Journal, but more people are going to read it in Amazing Heroes. And Amazing Heroes was the #1 magazine for comic fans at that point. So it really was going to get a bigger audience in Amazing Heroes. And boy, I'll tell you, it did. Now, one of the things that made it unusual for me was I had to make a choice at that point. It felt important to me, having just come out myself to anyone in 1987.
Which was actually a big deal at the time.
I had to make a choice. Am I going to come out in the article? Am I going to reveal this? And I felt it was important to, I was trying to maintain journalistic integrity and ethics. So I didn't want to do it right at the start. I didn't want to have it be like, hey, here's a gay writer writing about this. So I came out at the end of the article, not subtly enough that some people probably missed it, but not subtly enough that it went over 90% of the people's heads. The In doing that, I became the first openly gay person who was working in mainstream comics at that point. There were people who I interviewed for the article that were like Howard Cruz, who were working in underground comics. But in terms of mainstream comics, either color comics for the big two, Marvel or DC, or independent books like First or Kamiko or Eclipse or things like that, there was nobody who was out. And I became the first one, which put a lot of a lightning rod onto me.
Important for you to do that at the time?
I felt it was, and I think history shows that it was, because until that article had been written, it had never been addressed at all in comics itself. In the entire comic industry had been silent about it completely. And then on top of that, nobody would come out. And so it started the discussion, and finally there was somebody who was willing to come out. Everything snowballed very quickly after that as to what that meant.
Positively or
The
negatively?
Both, both. Interestingly enough, hadn't even been on my radar, although I had talked about Omaha the Cat Dancer, which was published by Kitchen Sink, and which straddled the line between an underground book, and a mainstream book, but because it was adults only. But most people considered it semi-mainstream. And so I had talked about it because it had gay characters in it, but it didn't even occur to me that the husband and wife team behind it, Reed Waller and Kate Worley, had anything to say other than talk about their characters. Turns out, independent of me doing this article, they had decided that in that summer issue of Omaha the Cat Dancer, they were going to come out in their letters column as bisexual, both of them. So it was a married couple coming out as bi, and they became the first bi creators in comics. And then June of 1988 comes up, and it's bam, 2 issues of Amazing Heroes. Finally, somebody in the comics industry comes out, and then the creators of Omaha the Cat Dancers come out as bisexual. And it, like, it's all anyone was talking about. That was the biggest story of the summer. So I went to the San Diego Comic Con people and I said, hey, I'd like to do a panel on this article, which was called Out of the Closet into the Comics, The Creators and the Creations. And I said, I'd like to do a panel called Gays in Comics. They were like, I said, look, this is big news. And they knew that. They knew it was all in the news, but they were, what are you going to talk about? Is it going to be sexual in nature? What I didn't realize at the time, that Shell Dorf, who was one of the people running the convention, was a closeted gay man himself. So he was like, oh, no, don't want to do this, because he was closeted. But the other people were, yeah, this seems like it could be interesting, but we don't know how interesting. We don't know what this is going to mean. So we'll give you a panel, but we aren't going to put it in one of our normal panel rooms, because just in case it goes into adults only area, or just in case it only has a few people or whatever, we're going to put you in the theater room, which was a building separate from the main convention center. And it was literally a stage theater with raked seating and the whole bit. And so it came time for that day, and I assembled a bunch of mostly heterosexual creators, a couple underground creators. And right before the panel, this woman comes up to me and she goes, hi, my name's Kay Reynolds. I write Fortune's Friends for, I think it was Starblaze Dawning. And I write some other comics, and I'd like to come out as bisexual on your panel. And I was like, great, okay. So I added her to the panel real quickly. We go out on stage, and we look into the audience, and there's 500 people. It was, the theater was filled.
So
There
it
were
exceeded
so
your
many people.
expectations.
Oh, it exceeded the Comic-Con's expectations. It was the best attended panel of the entire year. It was Hall H. For that time, they didn't know what we were going to do. Were we going to have live sex? Now we had two people that were out in the industry, me and Kay Reynolds, and we had Reed Waller and Kate Worley. So that was two people plus two that were on the edge. And then we had some underground people, and you had the article, and people were talking about it. And it became part of the conversation now. And so editors and writers now knew that this was in people's heads. So they could start writing queer characters, but they didn't know what they could do. What are the parameters? What was the comics code going to allow? What would the editors allow? What would the publishers allow? All these things were questions, and I became like the point man to answering those questions. And
Did you feel
so
comfortable about
I
doing
would,
all that, or did you feel pressured?
yes, all the above.
It was all going on, correct? Somewhere in
I
your early,
was. I was 21.
thrown
I
in the
was
spotlight, and you were
freshly out.
still a kid, really.
I was freshly out. I was at the start of my career, and suddenly I have editors calling me and saying, "Hey, we want to do this. How do you feel about that? How do you feel? What do you think? What do you know, et cetera?" And I had people calling me for career advice, and I had people. It was wild to think that this article,
Ignited fires.
a lot of people have said it was the Stonewall of comic books. It was the moment where something in the industry exploded, and this became a part of the discussion. I don't disagree with that statement. I'm not going to say it for myself because it sounds self-aggrandizing, but many other people have said things similar to that, or said that exact thing in ways that, like, this was the turning point. Prior to that, there was nothing, and suddenly there was this groundswell of discussion. Now, in the meantime, I had a career that I was still trying to start. While I was now the gay guy in comics, I was now the gay writer
Which
in
you didn't
comics.
expect in the first place.
I was now still trying to just write. I was trying to
That
write
had been a lot
comics,
of
and I was
pressure on you at that age. And did you feel like you handled it well, considering?
mostly, I do know I was a little in your face about with the gay stuff, and I got called out on that by several people, and certain editors and certain publishers took umbrage at me being so out.
What did they expect you to be?
I was working at the time for Pegasus Books, which was a subsidiary of the company that owned Dark Horse Comics, and I was harassed out of my job working for the comic book store by the owner's brother, who was homophobic. Mike Richardson at Dark Horse was trying to be supportive, but his brother was being homophobic. And so he was in this tight, and laws were not fully in place yet to protect me or any other queer employee. So that happened. I was working on a book for Eclipse Comics, and Kat Ironwood, who was the secondary head of Eclipse Comics, was offended over some of my actions. And she was like, "We're not going to let you do publicity because we don't know that we can trust you."
Whatever happened to her? Does anybody know?
She's still alive. She's in Russian River, and she's just living her life, doing whatever she's doing.
Because she was also very big at that time with that, and she had a column in Comic Buyer's Guide.
Yeah, but the person who I probably had the worst time with, and I will preface this by saying that a lot of what I have heard is from other people. There's very little happened directly to my face. Some of it did, but Mike Carlin at DC Comics was very antagonistic towards me. When I did the original Gays in Comics article, post doing that, in fact, he blew up at me once at Comic-Con. They were doing the Death of Superman press conference. And I started to ask a question about Maggie Sawyer, the lesbian character in Superman, and he just blew up, started screaming at me on the panel. We will not be answering questions from you. It was like Trump. He didn't call me piggy, everything short of that. He just blew up. And then in the years since, I've heard that anytime my name has been brought up at DC or Marvel, that Mike Carlin is around, that he has badmouthed me and negatively talked about what an awful person I am and everything else. All of this seems to relate to me being gay.
Because that doesn't fit. Andy Mangels has now been in the industry for 40 years, and we could sit there and do a whole show on just your resume of stuff.
But
you're really a really good-natured person.
I think those people who had problems with me in the industry have problems with anybody gay in the industry. But it's much easier to turn down writers and artists. You can look at their work and say, yes, I want to work with you or not. But all it takes is for one editor at DC to say, hey, I'm thinking of hiring Andy Mangels to write Aquaman, and for another editor to say, oh God, Andy Mangels, I hate him. That's all it takes. And that first editor says, maybe not, maybe I'll hire somebody else. It's just having a little bit of negative energy can go a long way when you're in editorial power. Something else really strange happened with my career, which was that they were doing an issue that was a Wonder Woman special, and it was when George Perez was rebooting Wonder Woman. And they were looking around for interesting Wonder Woman articles. And this was 87, I think, 87, 88. And I think it was 87. I said, why don't I try and interview Linda Carter? The TV show had only been off the air at that point 8 years. So it was still fairly fresh in people's minds. I couldn't get, Linda Carter wouldn't do an interview. And so I says, how about Lyle Wagner? That he was second in command on the show. He's got to have some great stories.
Was there a reason why she wouldn't do it?
Oh yeah, because she was like, I'm not Wonder Woman anymore. At that point in time, she was distancing
now she
herself.
embraces Wonder Woman.
Now she embraces it, but not then. But she was distancing herself from the character at that point. So I called up Lyle Wagner, and he agreed that he'd do an interview. So then I went to the editor, and he's like, Lyle Wagner. Now, what nobody knew at the time was that Lyle Wagner had been the first choice for Batman before Adam West. So that wasn't a known thing at that point. So when I interviewed him, that was like, hey, I was almost Batman. And then I became Steve Trevor. So I did this interview with Lyle Wagner, and then I forget what my next thing was, but that went over really well. And then I did another Hollywood-oriented interview and another Hollywood-oriented interview. And suddenly I got to be known for the guy who could do Hollywood interviews.
That you got lucky and stumbled into by accident. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and realized I was living in Montana when I interviewed Lyle Wagner on the phone,
Perfect place. Great place to be interviewing somebody.
and then I moved to Portland, and so I'm starting to do more and more Hollywood stuff. And then I pitched a column to them called Andy Mangels Backstage that was going to be just about Hollywood. This is at the time period when comics and Hollywood were starting to really gel together. Just pre Batman the movie, a lot of stuff was still in reruns. Hulk was still in reruns. Wonder Woman was still in reruns. There was cartoon stuff on Super Friends was on cartoons, although it was changing to superpowers at that point. So there was this point of Hollywood seemed to be moving towards comics, and I saw that coming, and I said, let me do a column about a regular column. So I started doing that, and I would interview whoever I could, whether it was a makeup person, an actor, a writer, a director, a producer, anybody who would talk to Amazing Heroes magazine, I would talk to.
Was it hard putting that column together? Because you didn't have a whole lot of people in the industry and networking.
It was. It was.
And you're still in your 20s, and on top of having
There,
people to take you seriously.
and I'm not in Hollywood. I'm in Portland. So the biggest issue I faced in Hollywood was nobody knew what the hell Amazing Heroes magazine was. They didn't know what the comic book press was. Publicists had zero idea that there was a comic book press. Just zero idea. And like trying to get them to understand that this was a thing, and that if they let their stars do interviews with me, it would be beneficial to them, was strange. One of the most famous ones, and I would talk about some of these difficulties in the column itself. One of the most famous ones I had was when there was a TV show called My Secret Identity, and Jerry O'Connell played a teenage boy who gets superpowers and becomes a secret superhero while still being a teenage boy. And it's literally called My Secret Identity. It was a Canadian show, 3 seasons. It took me till the 3rd season before I got the press people from that show to agree to send me anything, because they kept arguing it was not a comic book show, it was not a superhero show, it was just a show about a teenage boy with superpowers. They didn't want Jerry O'Connell doing comic book press because that would brand him as comic book. And they didn't want that because they were looking at that as being Batman, Superman, Hulk. They were looking at it as being a negative thing, as opposed to leaning into the fact that there's this whole audience that you could get for your show if people understood there's a show about literally a comic book fan who gets superpowers and becomes a superhero. That is exactly the audience you want to be reading an interview with him. But they argued with me for 2 years that it was not appropriate for Amazing Heroes to be writing about My Secret Identity.
That's amazing that they would go down that road.
And over time, I started building up more and more contacts in Hollywood. And I would get producers and directors who would read my column and who would feed me stuff. I hear New Line's working on this, or hey, I hear thus and such is working on this. And then I would run down those leads. This was every 2 weeks as a column, and I would have to write them about a month and a half in advance. So it wasn't like today's internet where it's like you hear a rumor, you put it out there immediately, or somebody else is going to. This was something where I had time to run down that rumor, and I had time to call such and such is supposedly writing a treatment for Judge Dredd. Okay, let's call that writer and find out. And the writer's, yeah, I'm writing. At that point in time, there was no such thing as spoilers. The importance of the audience would leak me scripts. They would send me the scripts.
When you're still in your early 20s, and now
Yeah,
you're this big Hollywood power broker kind of guy getting leaked scripts.
Go ahead. And so I started developing this whole network of people who were sending me material and sending me stuff. And it became a little easier and a little easier and a little easier.
Did you feel overwhelmed? Did you feel overwhelmed during this time, even with doing this type of stuff?
Excited.
That's where
I
the
was so
manic. That's where
excited.
the
What,
manic Andy
you
came
know,
in.
it was like, it was amazing to me to get to do this. And I'm about to go into the story where Superman's 50th anniversary was about to happen. Amazing Heroes wanted to do a big special, like Superman double size, triple size issue, whatever. So they says, you got to interview as many people as you can on Superman. So I tracked down everybody who was still alive from the George Reeves show, Christopher Reeve, Helen Slater, Margot Kidder, all these people, Mark McClure, and I was setting up interviews with all of them. Now, two things happened. Number one, Margot Kidder got to me late, but I still have a phone message machine, and I still have the cassette tape of Margot Kidder, where it's because a friend came over one day and I started listening to my messages, and suddenly it's like, "Hi, Andy, this is Margot Kidder. Just calling you back. I guess you wanted to talk or something. Go ahead and give me a call back." And he's like unmistakably, it was Margot Kidder's voice. And he's, Margot Kidder just called you? And then Christopher Reeve, I called and talked to very briefly. He was working on a stage play, and he was like, it's not that I don't want to talk to you. I'm so focused on this. Let's schedule an interview later. And so with that, later became never, because he had his accident. And so I never did get to interview Chris Reeve or Margot Kidder. But I did get to speak to both of them. But for me, that element of getting to talk to the people who I watched on TV, who I grew up with, that was so fantastic.
Was it hard for you to separate between the fanboy type person and that type with the journalistic Andy Mangels?
I was more of a fanboy when I was talking to them, but as a writer, I was very serious about stuff.
Yeah, but it would be hard to get the good journalistic bites out of while interviewing him. Well, still,
Yeah,
I'm a fanboy, and I'm
yeah, but it was the eventually the fanboy stuff started helping, because once the studio started accepting that there was a comic book press, that there was actual places to put their interviews, then they started saying, okay, we want to make sure it's good interviews. We want to make sure it's not something where it's going to be treating our actors stupidly. So the fact that I was a fan and I was clearly excited about it actually helped. I do remember there was an interesting thing that happened on The Flash, where I got to fly down to LA and do a set visit on The Flash. And I was going to be interviewing all the main Flash cast. I was going to be going on while they were filming an episode, the whole bit. And I remember when the publicist found out that I was the gay guy in comics, suddenly there was a concern, because there were rumors that John Wesley Shipp was gay, the star of the show. And so there was a concern that what would I ask him? And she said, are you going to ask him about this? And I was like, no, I promise I won't ask him about it. And she goes, I'm going to sit in on the interview just to be sure. So she actually sat in on the interview with John Wesley Shipp to make sure I didn't ask him about being gay. Interesting thing was, I didn't ask him, but I wore a gay t-shirt. It was a t-shirt, a safe sex t-shirt that was Clark Kent kissing Dick Tracy, and it said, Clark wants Dick, Dick wants condoms.
okay.
And very specifically a gay shirt. And that's what I wore to interview John Wesley Shipp. And we sat across the table from each other in his trailer with the publicist sitting right there. And we did our interview, and he never once looked at my shirt. He did, but he didn't. He never addressed the shirt. I never brought the question up. I never reported on it until he got outed by the tabloids. And then I reported, the tabloids have outed John Wesley Shipp. Then I would report on it because someone else had already done so. But at that point in time, there was so many things that were happening in that realm. Number one, you had the rise of comic book projects. You had The Rocketeer, you had The Flash on television, you had Warren Beatty's Dick Tracy, you had Tim Burton's Batman. So all these things are starting to happen, and things are being taken seriously. On the gay side of things, AIDS was at its height, and there was a lot of political discussion over whether it was okay to out people, outing being saying somebody's gay without their permission, whether it was okay to do that and what were the rules for that. And journalists were having that discussion. Was it okay if they were anti-gay, if they said something anti-gay, and then you would say, you're a gay person yourself, why are you saying this anti-gay thing? Was it okay if they were HIV positive? Was it okay if they were, at what point is it okay to do that? And there was a lot of discussion in the press about that. There were people who felt it was appropriate to out politicians, but not movie stars. There were people who said, oh, movie stars are fair game, they're public figures. So it was definitely an issue. My feeling is that I wasn't going to out somebody without their permission, but if they got outed by somebody else, I would comment on that. And so that's what I did. When John Wesley Shipp got outed, I commented on it. And I said, I even related something. I knew about these rumors when I interviewed him, but I didn't ask him about it. I was not confirming, not denying, but leaning towards confirming. But that column that I wrote, Andy Mangels Backstage, that became my early legacy because that got me embedded in Hollywood, and yet I was living in Portland, Oregon.
Have you ever
Everyone
thought about
thought I lived in
collecting all
Hollywood.
those columns together again for historical purposes?
I haven't yet. I've talked about doing it.
It's hard to find them Amazing Heroes back issues. I've got them all on PDF. I'm not going to say how, but I've got them all on PDF, and I referred to them, and I'm like,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
wish not just those, but like the comic reader and the other ones that somebody would digitize them and
right.
put them out there for some kind of a library purpose.
Dynamite and both Dynamite and Tomorrow's have talked to me about doing collections of my stuff, but they don't want to do complete collections. They want to pick and choose. And I know I'd really rather do a complete collection because on a historical basis, this really tracks how things were developed and how things were happening. That column led to so much of my career. So because I was embedded in Hollywood now, innovation, the first thing that happened was Blackthorn Comics was doing licensed 3D comics. They did G.I. Joe in 3D and etc. And so they got the right to do Nightmare on Elm Street in 3D. And I was a huge Nightmare on Elm Street fan and was trying to get a job at Marvel working on their magazine that they did very briefly. And so I went to Blackthorn and I got the job doing the Nightmare on Elm Street in 3D book, which never came out. But then Innovation, Dave Campiti Innovation was like, oh, you're connected to Hollywood. We're having a great success doing the Vampire Lestat book. And we're doing Beauty and the Beast based on the TV show. We want to do some more Hollywood stuff. Can you help us? And I'm like, yeah, can you hire me? And so that was how I started negotiating licenses for Innovation for Child's Play and Nightmare on Elm Street and Psycho and Quantum Leap and Dark Shadows and things like that. I started actively pursuing licenses for them.
How old were you at that time?
24.
That's why I want to make sure that I put that out there because this is not a 30, 40-year-old man who's had, you're 24
Right.
and you're still really a kid at this time, no matter
Yeah,
how
yeah,
you
yeah.
put at it.
Yeah. But that led to that aspect. And then Marvel approached me at one point and they said, we really love what you're doing in Amazing Heroes with your Hollywood column. Would you want to do a similar column for Marvel Age? And I think it was Jim Salicrup and suddenly I was now franchised. I now had 2 columns with my name in it.
At 24.
Yeah, 24, 25. And then a British magazine approached me and says, can we get you to do a column for us? And then an Italian magazine approached me, and then a South American magazine. And suddenly I'm like literally internationally, I'm writing columns internationally, all of which I branded with Andy Mangels as the start of it. So it was Andy Mangels Backstage, Andy Mangels Real Marvel, Andy Mangels Hollywood Heroes, etc. It was always branded with my name. And so I suddenly I was the Hollywood, instead of just being the gay guy in comics, I was now the Hollywood guy. and the game. So I had done so in a way that was really forward thinking in terms of what I saw, where the industry was going and its ties to Hollywood.
Had Amazing Heroes folded in 92, had
Mm-hmm.
that not folded, would you have continued to work at Amazing Heroes or were you growing out of it at that time?
Oh, I think I would have been there. I was there till the end, and I think I
Yes.
would have been there if it were going today. I think I'd still be there. The only reason I left Amazing Heroes was because it folded, and the moment Fantagraphics announced that Amazing Heroes was folding was when Wizard started, and Gareb Shamus calls me up and he says, "So I've got this new magazine I'm doing called Wizard. Would you do your column for us?" And I said, "I'm still doing it for Amazing Heroes." And then within days, Amazing Heroes announces it's going to fold.
Did it
And
fold
I'm
because
like,
of poor circulation?
I never really understood why it folded, but I think it was a lack of the Fantagraphics people stopped caring about it. It was a lot of work. And putting that magazine out every 2 weeks was a huge amount of work. I think the ad sales were down and things like that. And the industry was really going through a massive shift. You had distributors that were folding and Marvel buying distributors, and you had all these things were happening. This is right before Image Comics started. So the industry as a whole was just in an upheaval. And I think Amazing Heroes became one of the casualties of it. And Wizard Magazine became the new thing.
And that was the rise of the creators almost being like rock stars.
Yes, and color magazines. So Amazing Heroes had always been black and white and was till it died. Wizard was bright color and everything else. And every magazine that came after that was all color. So I ended up writing the Hollywood column for Wizard, and then fan magazines. I think it was Overstreet started one called Fan, and there was another one called Hero Illustrated, and all of them kind of cherry picked me from the "we'll offer you more money to write your column for us."
As a
And
24 and
so I left.
25-year-old.
Yeah, by now I was 26, 27.
Okay.
So I wrote for Wizard for a couple of years. Then I went to Hero Illustrated or Fan, and then I wrote from that to the other. And I would ride each magazine until I either got a better job offer or the magazine folded. Now, what ended up happening was the internet. That's what killed the fan magazine.
Everything.
But by then, it killed everything, yeah. But by then, I had built up such an audience and such an empire of doing these Hollywood columns. I was doing them in 4 different countries, and I was doing it. There was actually a Fantasia magazine out of England. I have in my files was going to give me my own magazine that was called Andy Mangels Hollywood Heroes. And it was going to be nothing but comic book news and comic book / Hollywood interviews. And they published an issue of it that they did a mock-up cover with the Flash on it, and then they published like some of my articles all the same 6 times in a row, just to say here's what the magazine would look like, that they could take to their distributors and say here's what we're thinking of doing. It didn't fly, and their magazine went under shortly thereafter, but I still have a couple copies of Andy Mangels Hollywood Heroes as its own magazine. That's how popular it was, is that people were actually looking at giving it its own magazine. The juxtaposition of where I was in Hollywood versus where I was in comics really led to a lot of my career, which I think, given our time, we probably maybe let's get to that in another interview.
I
But
was going to ask you, I'm like, you're the Energizer Rabbit here.
wind me
So,
up, I start going. I think that's a good stopping point, because you got really the juxtaposition of my career, and it's why I call myself a pop culture historian, because everything that I did as a fan writer influenced how diverse my career has been. The fact that I wrote best-selling Star Wars books, the fact that I wrote best-selling Star Trek books, the fact that I produced and directed 40 documentaries and produced DVD sets, the fact that I did trading cards, the fact that I did all the books that I've written and the magazine articles I've written and the comics I've written. Right.
and you're like, I can talk really good. I'm like, really, Andy? I'm like, wow, Andy, you've exceeded my expectations. But no, and my big problem with when I don't like to bring people on where they're just talking heads, where you're
Mm.
on there for 10, 15 minutes and oh my God, what the hell? Get to the point. Andy, I really do appreciate because you also gave a lot of meaty stuff. I hope you've had a lot of enjoyment doing this time around.
I talk about my fanzine career as if it's not over because it's not. I still write for fanzines. I still write almost every issue of Retro Fan magazine from Tomorrow's. And what am I writing about? Saturday morning cartoons and Saturday morning TV shows. And I write occasionally for Back Issue magazine and some of the others. And my entire career is owed to fan magazine writing. And I wish that industry existed in the form that it did. People are like, yeah, but there's web pages and there's this and that.
It's not
Not the same at all. And it's
the
not the same as learning to write under an editor, learning to proofread your stuff, and learning to write on a deadline.
the closest thing to those right now, you're right, are the Tomorrow's publication, whether it's back issue, retro fan, alter ego's a little more historical thing, but that's the closest you have to
Yeah.
that type of magazine.
Yeah.
Andy Mangels, I'm going to wrap this show up. Thank you so much for joining me. This has been a fantastic taping. I will definitely be having you on again. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. My beard thanks you. And I wish you best of luck on the show.